Right, why don't we go ahead and get started? It looks like most folks are here. So I want to say thank you for joining us today on this webinar. A couple of housekeeping items on the front end. This webinar will be recorded and then shared out with attendees afterward. The webinar chat and the question and answer features are enabled for your use throughout the webinar. There will be a formal Q&A at the end, but feel free to send your questions in throughout, and Carolyn and I will do our best to get to them either in the moment if we see them or in that Q&A session at the end as well. With those kind of housekeeping items out of the way at the front end, I am Jason Gromley. I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy and Government Relations. And on behalf of the entirety of Share Our Strength, I'm really excited to welcome you to our kind of what to expect for the 118th Congress. There's a lot of stuff happening in DC, as I'm sure you've seen. And so I wanted to take a moment to walk you through what we're expecting over the next year and a half with this Congress. And I am happy to be joined today by my colleague, Carolyn Vega, who will introduce herself in just a second. But Adu, if you want to go over to the next slide, talk a little bit about what's on the agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about who we are as an organization. I'll give you a little background there. Then I'll talk a little bit about the political happenings, what's going on in the 118th Congress so far, what do we know, what don't we know at this point. And then I'll turn it over to Carolyn to talk about some of our federal policy priorities in some more detail. And then we'll talk about some next steps, what we've got going on, and then we will have our Q&A at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Carolyn.
Great, thanks so much, Jason, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Jason said, I'm Carolyn Vega. I'm the Associate Director of Policy Analysis here at Share Our Strength. So I work very closely with Jason and his entire advocacy and government relations team. But first, I wanted to provide a quick overview for those of you who may be new to Share Our Strength or only familiar with a piece of our work. The mission of Share Our Strength is ending hunger and poverty in the US and abroad. And we're fulfilling this mission through campaigns like No Kid Hungry, which I'll talk more about in a moment, as well as Cooking Matters, which helps parents and caregivers shop for and prepare healthy meals on a budget, and our consulting arm, Community Wealth Partners. And so our No Kid Hungry campaign is committed to ending childhood hunger in the United States. Sadly, millions of children in America live in households struggling with food insecurity, meaning they don't have reliable access to the healthy food they need to thrive. So we're addressing hunger by helping to expand and improve federal nutrition assistance programs, and by working alongside the U.S. Department of Agriculture and state agencies administering these programs, and working alongside the schools and community organizations feeding kids every day. So we're really supporting them in maximizing these federal nutrition programs. And we do this through technical assistance. We do this at the national level through our Center for Best Practices that creates resources and hosts webinars. We also do this through a network of state campaigns and state partners. We also offer grants, which support schools and community organizations with some startup and expansion costs that may not be covered through usual federal nutrition program funds. And we also pilot new ideas with our grants. And finally, we're committed to ending childhood hunger through advocacy, working at the national, state, and local level to really improve and expand these programs. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking more about today. So with that, I will turn it over to Jason.
Excellent, thank you, Carolyn. Welcome to the 118th Congress. As I'm sure you were all watching a couple weeks ago as the House tried to figure out who the next speaker was going to be, it's already had a lot of fireworks. There's already been a lot of crazy things that have happened here in DC. From a political science perspective, it's been fascinating to watch. It's also been a little bit frustrating and just wanting to get down to work and get things across the finish line. Before I jump into kind of what's up going forward, I want to talk a little bit about what we just witnessed in the end of the last Congress. So after the election, we really saw Congress kick into gear and try to get a bunch of things off of their to-do list before the beginning of this new Congress. And one of those was a spending bill called an omnibus spending bill, kind of bringing all 12 appropriations bills into one to pass that. and get it off of the decks for this new Congress. There was a lot of interest from the Democratic Party to do that in the Biden administration, because obviously the Republicans took the House of Representatives in the election. So unified Democratic control in Washington was going to be a thing of the past. So they wanted to get it off their decks. The Senate Republicans really wanted to get it done as well, because they were nervous about the ability of House Republicans to kind of coalesce and actually get something done without forcing a shutdown. And then the House Republicans really didn't want it. They did not want to do a spending bill at the end of the last Congress, and were really forceful in saying, no, we want to wait until we have more leverage to exact some concessions from the Biden administration and Senate Democrats. The kind of majority there won. The Senate Republicans, Democrats across the board won the day, and they passed an omnibus bill that had a lot of provisions in there. But a big one that we're going to talk a little bit about later are really things around non-congregate, and then on Summer EBT, which have been longtime priorities of Share Our Strength, and we've been working towards for a long period of time. Those are important because there's going to be some implementation challenges and things that we're going to be looking at going forward. It's also important to note those wins because it cleared the decks for some other things that can now move forward in this Congress, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So what's up with the 118th Congress? Well, we're looking at a historically narrow margin for House Republicans. They do have the majority. You do have Speaker Kevin McCarthy from California is the majority leader in the House, but he's got a really tight majority, which we saw when it took a historic 15 votes to get him that Speaker's gavel in the first couple of days of this Congress. A couple things I'll just note here. We did have one member who passed away already in this Congress, the congressman from Virginia's 4th Congressional District. And so there will be a special election in late February to fill that seat. It's expected to go to the Democrats in that. It's a pretty heavily Democratic district. So we're looking at somewhere probably around 222 Republicans, 213 Democrats in the House. We've already seen some of the divisions on the Republican side here with that speakership vote, where conservatives exacted a lot of concessions from Congressman McCarthy in order for him to become Speaker McCarthy. And those concessions are going to reverberate throughout the entirety of this Congress. There are going to be a lot of things that happen or don't happen because of the concessions to the rules package especially, but also committee assignments and getting some very conservative members on committees that are going to have a really big impact on the ability of House Republicans to move legislation across the finish line, particularly the Rules Committee, which is arguably the most powerful committee in all of Congress. They control every piece of legislation that comes to the floor, whether or not there will be amendments to it on the floor. And the Freedom Caucus, the most conservative members of the House Republican Conference, did get 3 members on that Rules Committee. So they're going to have a lot of influence on whether or not specific bills come to the floor. And as I'm sure most of you know, but I'll put a fine point on it, they have some very serious concerns about federal spending. They have a lot of serious concerns about federal government overreach. And so there are going to be a lot of challenges, I think, that we'll see come to the fore, both on the conservative side of the aisle, but also with Democrats being tapped to kind of break the stalemate and try to get things across the finish line that just must pass and must get done. So if you want to go to the next slide, Adu. So who are the leaders in this Congress? As I mentioned already, we've got Speaker McCarthy, who after those 15 votes did eke out his victory there. He is joined by Majority Leader Steve Scalise from Louisiana, and then Tom Emmer from Minnesota is the 3rd Republican in charge. There's also the 4th would be Elise Stefanik from New York, who is also on the leadership team On the Democratic side, you've got Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Minority Whip Catherine Clark, and then Pete Aguilar from California is the Dem Caucus chair. I kind of lumped them all together because in the House, the minority has very little power. It is a majority rules institution. The Republican conference has a lot of authority and power here. The Dems are going to be kind of on the sidelines largely. And frankly, they're probably going to be sitting back, as they were accused of during the speakership vote, eating some popcorn and watching some fireworks, and then stepping in to help break the logjam at the last minute if they need to keep the government open, to extend the debt limit, all of those pieces that are functions of the government that are at risk, frankly, because of some of the concerns of the more conservative members of the GOP conference. This is also a really new leadership team on the Democratic side of the aisle. You had Speaker Pelosi and her leadership team step aside, take a step back, and let a new generation of leaders step forward on the Democratic side in this cycle. So it's going to be interesting to see how they blossom as leaders. They already passed, I think, their biggest test in keeping their entire conference together during the speakership vote, not losing a single Democrat to voting present or voting for someone other than Mr. Jeffries as the next speaker. So that was some party discipline we don't always see on the Democratic side. So it was interesting to watch that, and I think we'll see a lot more of those pieces come forward in the coming weeks as they look at some of these other things that we'll talk about in a second. Next slide, we'll talk about some committee leadership. The speakership vote did delay the naming of speakers and selection, or I'm sorry, naming of committee chairs and selection of committee members. So some things are still a little bit in flux here, but we do have all the chairs and ranking members of the committees have been assigned. So a couple of folks of note here that I'll just call out: on the Agriculture Committee, which has jurisdiction over the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, so SNAP, SNAP Ed, the Farm Bill, which is a huge priority for us, which we'll talk a little bit about. That chairman will be G.T. Thompson, who's a Republican from Pennsylvania. On the Democratic side, leading that committee is David Scott from Georgia. Over on the appropriations side, which is the committee that has jurisdiction over all the federal spending. So that omnibus bill went through the appropriations committee. All 12 appropriations bills, kind of the annual spending on each of the departments, go through the appropriations committee. That's going to be led by Kate Granger, who is a Republican from Texas, and her Democratic counterpart will be Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut. They are just flipping positions. They were the lead Republican and lead Democrat in the last Congress as well, but Rosa DeLauro had the chairmanship then, and it's flipped over to Congresswoman Granger. And then on the Education and Workforce Committee, which has jurisdiction over school and community meals and WIC, the Child Nutrition Reauthorization, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard us talk about, that is going to be chaired by Representative Virginia Fox, a Republican of North Carolina, and then the Democratic counterpart will be Bobby Scott from Virginia. Again, that's just a flip from the last Congress. So all of the lead Democrats and Republicans on these three committees that have jurisdiction over many of the issues that we as an organization are focused on. They're all the same Democrats and Republicans, just kind of flipping positions after the Republicans took the majority. I will also flag a couple of other folks on these committees that are longtime champions of our work, have remained there. I will specifically call out Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, who is probably the biggest champion in the House on our issues on child nutrition and nutrition issues in general, addressing hunger. He is the co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus, a longtime champion of this work, and really has led many provisions and things forward in recent years. And so very excited that he'll be remaining on the Agriculture Committee and helping to protect the SNAP program during the Farm Bill negotiations. If you want to go to the next slide there. Let's talk about the Senate really quickly. This is the place where there have been some less seismic changes, less fireworks, but still some things of note. In particular, we now have one more Senate independent with Senator Sinema from Arizona switching from the Democratic Party to be an independent in the Senate. She, like the other two independents, are caucusing with the Democrats. So the Democrats do have a 51 seat majority to 49 Republicans. That may say it's still a tight majority. Let's not make any bones about it. But it is better than what they had in the last Congress, where it was an even 50-50 split. And Vice President Harris was basically living in the Senate chamber many days as she had to break so many procedural ties to give Democrats some victories on things. The biggest thing that this is going to do is it's going to give Democrats a 1-seat majority on committees, which is going to be a really big deal for them to be able to get, especially nominations off or out of a roadblock that has been being put up by some Republican committees out there. And so then the Democratic Senate leadership and Republican Senate leadership has remained the same. We have Senator Schumer from New York and Senator McConnell from Kentucky are the two leads there. Nothing much has changed. So if we want to go over to the next slide. We are looking at the important committees here. There are only really 2 committees in the Senate that touch on our issues in a really robust way. There are others that kind of are tangentially aligned, and as we expand and start thinking about additional work streams in areas that impact kids, some other committees will come into play. But right now, primarily, we're looking at the Agriculture and the Appropriations Committee. So on the agriculture side, we have the same leadership that we had in the last Congress with Senator Stabenow from Michigan and Senator Bozeman from Arkansas. Those big omnibus wins that we talked about with the Summer EBT and non-congregate meals in the summer, those were really authored by both Senator Stabenow and Senator Bozeman and moved them across the finish line. I'll give particular shout out to Senator Bozeman, who was a champion on these and really helped make sure that they were included in that final bill and that final package, helping feed kids during the summer months. The other thing I'll note about the Agriculture Committee, this will be Senator Stabenow's last time as chair because she is retiring at the end of her term. She's up for re-election in 2024, and so she is not running for re-election. So this will be her last term, which means it's her last farm bill. It also means that if she is ever going to work on another child nutrition reauthorization as a member of Congress, then this would be her last term to do that as well. Over on the appropriations side, we have a new Democratic lead with Patty Murray, who's a longtime senator, but stepped into the role after the longtime chair, Senator Leahy, retired at the end of the last Congress. And so Senator Murray is now the chair there from Washington State, joined by Senator Collins from Maine. A particularly cool thing, it's the first time in Congress's history that the Appropriations Committee in both the House and Senate are being chaired and led on the minority party side by women. So Murray and Collins work really well together, have for many years on a lot of pieces of the legislation. So it'll be really interesting to see how they're able to shepherd some of these spending bills across the finish line. There are also just a bunch of other members of the Agriculture and Appropriations Committee that I could talk about as champions for our work, but particularly I'll shout out Senator Booker from New Jersey and Senator Braun from Indiana, so Democrat and Republican respectively, who are the Senate chairs of the Congressional Hunger Caucus. They are big champions of our work, and we're very excited to work with them to ensure that many of the things that came out of the White House conference last year, which they were the Senate sponsors of, the White House conference on hunger, health, and nutrition, making sure that a lot of the provisions and things that we championed in that package come to fruition in the new year. And then over on the next slide, and then I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Carolyn to talk about our policy priorities. But want to talk, like, what do we expect? Like, what's actually going to happen in this Congress? As we saw during the speakership vote, there's going to be some political infighting. And it's not just going to be on the Republican side. There are a lot of tensions in Congress right now between the progressive end of the Democratic conference, the more moderate wing in both the House and the Senate on a lot of provisions. And so we're expecting to see those political fights happen I will say, unlike in previous years, the Democrats are being, I think, a little bit more disciplined at keeping those fights behind closed doors versus the Republicans, who a lot of that dirty laundry is being aired in public, both on the House and the Senate side, and between the two chambers, frankly. And then that's going to mean that big legislative victories are very unlikely. It's not likely that we're going to see some big policy shifts or big moves forward. Not only did the Democrats lose control of the House, and now Republicans are looking to exact some concessions from both the administration and Senate Democrats, but we're also expecting, because of that more political instability, a really difficult time to get to 218 in the House to pass legislation. Even the things that are must-pass pieces of legislation, it's going to be a lot more challenging to get there. Doesn't mean all hope is lost, but it's also going into a presidential election year where Congress doesn't like to give the incumbent president any wins when the opposing party is in charge of one of the chambers. So what's the House going to be looking at? Investigations. Investigating the Biden administration was one of the kind of chief tenets across the board of especially House Republican campaigns. And so we expect to see a lot of investigations of various departments and programs and provisions. They, in fact, are setting up several new select committees to investigate the Biden administration and the quote unquote deep state in the federal government as well. There are also going to be a lot of messaging bills. This is something that happens pretty often in the House. The Democrats do it, Republicans do it, everyone does it. It's bills that are partisan in nature. I think that you're going to see even more of that kind of stuff pop up because you have a more open amendment process on the floor. And so there's going to be, I think, a lot more opportunity for some more social issues and things to pop up from both sides of the aisle in messaging votes on the House floor. And then I think that these are probably in order of importance to the conference in charge down in the House, but then they'll start looking at must-pass legislation. There are some big things on the horizon. You've got the debt limit, which is already starting a lot of broadsides across the Hill and between the administration and members of Congress. You've also got the appropriations bills, all 12 of them. The House Republican Conference has said that they are going to get all 12 of them across the finish line before they go on summer recess. I am skeptical of that. It is very hard in any given year to get all 12 appropriations bills across the finish line, but it is what they have said they want to do. And so optimism gives us the opportunity to say, okay, let's work on those and see what we can do to help make sure that they're taking care of kids and providing the resources necessary to implement programs. And then the Farm Bill, it's reauthorized every 5 years. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but the Farm Bill is another piece of must-pass legislation. And then more investigations. That's really going to be the tone, I think, from the House in the next 2 years. On the Senate side, because there's not going to be a lot of legislating happening, and because Democrats now have that majority on committees, they're going to be focused on moving judges, and then stalled presidential appointments to cabinet offices, to undersecretary positions, lots of places where there have been acting folks in for the duration of the Biden administration. So giving them some Senate approval is going to be, I think, top on their agenda there. And then they'll look at must-pass legislation and try to work with the House to get some of those things done. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Carolyn to talk a little bit more about some of those federal policy priorities in more detail. So Carolyn, take it away.
Great, thank you, Jason. So the first thing I'll talk about is our Farm Bill priorities, since, as Jason mentioned, that is must-pass legislation. For those of you who maybe want more background on SNAP and the Farm Bill, we do have a website with that. We can't go into all of it today. It's probably a webinar series on its own. But briefly, I will mention that although SNAP is a permanent entitlement program, we do look to the Farm Bill process every 5 years for updates and policy changes. And the Farm Bill is must pass because other programs within the Farm Bill would lapse if the Farm Bill was not renewed. So SNAP continues no matter what, but the Farm Bill still has to happen because of those other programs. So among our priorities are protecting the value of SNAP benefits. And specifically what we mean by that is protecting the update to the Thrifty Food Plan that resulted in a benefit increase. The update to the Thrifty Food Plan was directed by the bipartisan 2018 Farm Bill, but we've already seen the revision come under scrutiny from congressional Republicans. So we want to make sure that we don't go back on that really critical update that better aligned SNAP benefits with the current cost of food. Then beyond that kind of defensive element, we want to maintain and increase access to SNAP. And we want to do that by preserving and expanding something known as broad-based categorical eligibility, or BBCE. It's a way of streamlining eligibility and ensuring access for working families who are facing higher costs for things like housing, childcare, healthcare. We also want to expand and improve online ordering. We know that took off in a big way during the pandemic, but there's still much more to do for SNAP participants to be able to really access and leverage online ordering. We also oppose additional limits through things like asset testing, so limiting the assets that families can have in order to access SNAP benefits. We want to strengthen data collection and disaggregation so that we can better tell who's missing out on SNAP benefits. And we also support equity for tribal communities and U.S. territories. So things like allowing tribal community members to access both the commodity program, the federal distribution program on Indian reservations, or FDIPR, along with SNAP in the same month, similar to how other communities can access commodity support and SNAP in the same month. And we also want to make sure territories like Puerto Rico are able to access SNAP when they're currently limited and offering only a block grant program currently. And then we also want to defend and expand access to SNAP Ed. Our Cooking Matters campaign, for example, can leverage SNAP Ed funding to do nutrition education for SNAP participants. So we want to maintain those current funding streams and also provide increased flexibility within program activities, evaluation, and allowable expenses. We have our full list of Farm Bill priorities on our website now. So if you want to review those or share them, you can. And so we'll share that link in the chat as well. So that is it for now on the Farm Bill, but we do have some other regulatory priorities. We know this is going to be a busy year at USDA with lots of exciting things. One, the WIC food package update that is already out for public comment. So we're drafting a comment letter on that. And that's just, it was a standard or expected update to the WIC food package based on kind of their regular cycle for reviewing it and making sure it aligns with the dietary guidelines for Americans. Related, we also expect USDA to propose an update to the school meal patterns, again, to align them with the dietary guidelines. So those should be coming out soon. And again, we'll look to submit a comment letter on that. And then we are also expecting the USDA to release guidance soon for the non-congregate option for summer 2023. Jason mentioned the omnibus appropriations bill that was passed at the end of last year, at the tail end of the last Congress. That was exciting legislation that included a permanent non-congregate option for rural communities without access to traditional congregate summer meal sites. And that legislation did allow USDA to start doing that non-congregate option this summer. And then they'll issue regulations sometime this year for kind of what will be the permanent guidelines for that for summer 2024 and beyond. And the omnibus appropriations bill also authorized a permanent nationwide summer EBT benefit. Summer EBT is a program that works a little bit like SNAP, where it gives families with students eligible for free or reduced price school meals a grocery benefit on a debit style card, so that they have additional resources for groceries over summer vacation while schools are closed and kids lose out on school meals. And so that will go into effect in 2024. But for this summer 2023, pandemic EBT is actually still available. So we will have kind of both of these resources, non-congregate and pandemic EBT will be available this summer, and then non-congregate and summer EBT will be available in summer 2024 and beyond. And so again, we'll be doing a lot of work with USDA on what that guidance looks like and commenting on the interim final regulations that we expect to be released this year. I know we got several questions submitted in advance along with the webinar registration about those non-congregate and summer EBT provisions. I can try to handle them, but I think the main answer for now is that we don't quite know. There's still a lot of questions. The legislation provided some framework, but there's a lot that has to be clarified by USDA and through that regulatory process. So those are the big things that we have on the horizon. You'll notice that we do not have CNR priorities here, and that is because we do not expect CNR to come up at least this year. But I will defer to Jason if he wants to handle the questions we have about that.
Sure, thanks, Carolyn. And before, I'll save kind of an overview of CNR pieces for just a second from now, but want to talk first. I mentioned that there's unlikely to be some big seismic shifts and changes, big policy wins at the federal level. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of opportunity out there. So Carolyn just talked a lot about the state expansion of summer meals and how that happened in the Omni and some of the exciting news there, but then states have to implement those programs. And so we're going to be working pretty extensively over the next year all across the country with our partners on the ground, with elected officials, with some of the partners like the National Governors Association and Western governors to ensure that states and leaders understand how to implement those programs as those rules and regulations come out from USDA. Just as we're going to be working with USDA to make sure that we influence the direction that those policies take and that they are as easy to implement as possible for states and localities. Other big things that we're seeing a lot of momentum at the state level are things around universal meals, eliminating the reduced price category for school meals, state expansion of the child tax credit and or the earned income tax credit. And so just a couple of things on this front that I want to highlight for you. Universal meals, that's using state dollars to cover the cost of student copay and the gap in the federal reimbursement. It's oftentimes incentivizing or emphasizing CEP and trying to make sure that as many schools and areas are utilizing CEP as possible to help defray some of those state budget effects, but really looking at it as an opportunity to make sure that all kids get access to school meals where possible. There are a lot of states that are looking at universal meals expansion in this coming year. Just a few of them that we're paying attention to and working with partners on the ground who are really leading coalition efforts are places like Maine, Washington State, New Mexico, Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Maryland, Massachusetts. All these places are really looking at opportunities. I started with Maine because Maine has to fully fund their universal meals legislation that they passed in the last session. And so making sure that we're working to get those appropriations and that they can fully pay for every kid to have access there. On eliminating the reduced price category, that's utilizing state dollars to cover the cost of the reduced price copay. So kind of supplementing the federal funds there so that the kids who would qualify for reduced price can instead receive their meals for free. Again, a bunch of states, especially in the South, are looking at legislation around eliminating the reduced price category. I'm actually in Texas right now because we are meeting with state leaders who are going to be introducing legislation to eliminate the reduced price category in the Lone Star State, but we're also looking at similar legislation in Louisiana, in Arkansas, and in Kentucky. And then the next one I want to talk about is state expansion of the child tax credit and or the earned income tax credit. That's using state dollars to supplement those federal programs. We saw the transformative effects that an improved child tax credit especially had during the pandemic when Congress was able to include that for 1 year in an early version of the relief packages, it really had a dramatic effect on kids and families. But unfortunately, Congress could not come to a resolution to make that a permanent fix. And so you have a lot of states who are stepping into the fray and trying to figure out how to either improve existing programs in the state that added additional dollars, plussing those up, or creating, programs themselves. So just a couple of places that this is happening: New York, Virginia, Arkansas, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Michigan, Montana, and Nebraska. All those M states are looking at this legislation. And so we're tracking that and trying to figure out ways that we can provide as much support as we can to those local efforts to improve access to those programs at the state level as well. And if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about advocacy in the year ahead. So as I look to the next year, it's really continuing our bipartisan approach. We saw the effectiveness of courting, especially GOP leaders in the Senate, for the ability to move these policies across the finish line, but even at the state and local level, working with our partners and our local supporters to ensure that governors across the political spectrum, state legislators, mayors, all understand the importance of ending childhood hunger and how they can help. Is going to be especially important as we move back into, unfortunately, I think, a cycle of partisanship when it comes to a lot of anti-hunger efforts in communities. And so making sure that we're doing that education and that networking ahead of time so that we aren't playing defense as much, but have champions who have resonance in their communities and within their political influence sphere that are carrying the water for us without us having to convince them in the moment. Leveraging all of our collective assets to influence legislation and rulemaking. Carolyn talked about some of our priorities for the Farm Bill, but also the priorities that we had for the rulemaking process is going to be really important as we go into the new year. Another big thing that's still out there is the White House is still figuring out opportunities and ways to move forward with their White House strategy on hunger, nutrition, and health that came out of the conference last October. And so working closely with them to make sure that next steps there are as advantageous and beneficial to communities and kids as they possibly can be. Engaging with new, diverse, and unlikely voices. I like to tell my team all the time, it's great when we as an organization go into congressional offices or governor's offices and talk about the importance of ending childhood hunger. It's even better when it's somebody they don't expect that message to come from, when our corporate partners or when chefs or other folks are the ones who are delivering that message. It just resonates in a different way and brings even more people into the fold and shows how broad-based the support across the American public, but also industries and leaders across the country, folks that are listened to by these elected folks, how deep the support for ending childhood hunger goes. And then continuing to build those champions, as I talked about, for the bipartisan necessity here. Politics is cyclical, goes up, it goes down. One party's in control, then the other, it kind of bounces back and forth. And so making sure that we are building as deep a bench as we can across the ideological spectrum is going to be really key, but also up and down the ballot, as it were. We've seen the importance of engaging mayors with the growth of the Mayor's Alliance to End Childhood Hunger, which we helped launch last year. Now has over 130 mayors from across the country who just came together in DC last week and really are looking at opportunities that they can engage more deeply. Mayors tend to run for higher office and then continue to climb the ranks. We got a couple mayors who are actually in President Biden's cabinet right now. So making sure that we're cultivating those folks at lower level offices so that as they continue to grow, they understand the importance from the very beginning of their political career of these issues and areas. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to the questions, and I'm actually going to start where Carolyn kind of pitched out there on CNR and just what we expect and whether or not it's going to kind of come down the pike this year. I will say I don't expect it to. I think that there's a political challenge, there's a timing challenge. The Farm Bill is technically supposed to be reauthorized by the end of September this year. In talking to congressional leaders, they're not optimistic that they're going to be able to get it across the finish line. They're probably going to have to pass some sort of short-term patch because, as Chairman Thompson said when he joined the Mayor's Alliance last week, they're behind. In his estimation, they're probably about a year behind in the Farm Bill process, and so getting everything done before that September deadline is unlikely, which means that then they're going to roll that over into the new year. You're going to have a bunch of folks who, on the Senate side, again, remember we only have one committee on the Senate side that has jurisdiction over the Farm Bill and CNR. Their time is also going to be strapped with a bunch of other priorities and things that they've got on their plate. So I don't expect to see CNR come up this year. It doesn't have a forcing mechanism. There's not, drastic deep cuts or big policy shifts that are going to happen if they don't pass it on time. In fact, we are way overdue. It's supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years. We haven't had a new CNR since 2010. And so the likelihood that Congress is suddenly going to wake up and say, yes, let's fix all of these problems, I think is pretty unlikely.
Yeah, and I think that gets at another question that we received in advance that I think is an interesting one is there a possibility that the non-congregate option will be extended to programs other than rural programs? So that gets at the omnibus appropriations bill that I mentioned that authorized that permanent non-congregate option for rural communities without available congregate sites. And I think, again, to Jason's point about the possibilities of Congress working on child nutrition reauthorization means that unfortunately, no, I don't think there's an immediate opportunity for that kind of change to happen, although it's certainly something that we'll look at for the future because we know that the summer meals programs can be a challenge in all sorts of communities, not just rural communities. But I'll say that for the short term, we will certainly be working with USDA on what that definition of rural will be. We don't have that yet. That's to be defined by USDA. And we certainly hope for it to be as expansive as possible and to include community voice so that it accurately reflects how communities think of themselves, because we know that there are various definitions that the federal government uses and they all have some kind of limitation and don't always capture every community that, again, kind of thinks of itself as rural and has those limitations of rural communities. Let's see, okay, we just got a question in the chat. Did the non-congregate summer food service program option include other waivers from COVID like mealtime? Travel to a site would be much easier if it was once a week instead of daily or twice daily. Yes, our read of the legislation is that it would allow for distribution of meals for up to 10 days at a time. So that kind of bakes in that mealtime waiver that you're getting at, allowing programs to distribute, meal bundles or to do home delivery of meal packages that include meals for like a week at a time, rather than it being kids having to come to a site for breakfast, even if they can take it home and then come back for lunch and then take it home. Yes, you're welcome. Great news to us too. Makes a big difference. We've certainly learned through COVID.
I'm going to jump in on one of the questions that came in through the Q&A of mine. One of the things that was mentioned here, it's not quite a question, I would say it's more of a statement about military families and access to SNAP and school meals always being a big issue. I would say that that's probably going to come up a lot in the next couple of months as the House Republicans especially key in on that issue. It is something that I've heard a number of times from Republican leaders on the House Ag Committee as an area of focus for them, which is great. I think that it's a great opportunity to highlight the need there. I will also just put out there. It is somewhat a taboo subject. A lot of military leaders don't like to talk about it. And so it is something that I think there is, going to be some push and pull, but it is something that I know is going to be a priority and something that is raised during the Farm Bill negotiations.
And it is in our Farm Bill priorities shareable document. Just due to space reasons, we couldn't fit them all on the slide without having teeny tiny font. So we certainly do agree that hunger among active military and veteran families is an issue to be addressed. Let's see. People in school food service are worried about keeping the additional reimbursement that you're getting this year. That was authorized through legislation in 2022, I believe. Any thoughts on extending the additional reimbursement? I'll pitch that one to Jason since it gets at political possibilities of passing additional spending for school nutrition.
Yeah, I will say that it's something we're raising with appropriators. I'm trying to figure out how to, I want to categorize this carefully. I think that there is little appetite at the moment because a lot of folks are looking at the Omni that was just passed and saying, we just did all of this spending on school meal programs on all of these places. And so I think that there's going to be some education that needs to happen and helping folks understand the continued challenges that school nutrition providers are facing. So looking forward to working with all of our school nutrition partners to ensure that that is elevated in a way that that Congress hears the need, the continued need that's out there.
We got a question about the school meal pattern changes. And the question actually reads about changes that states are considering making. But the part that I mentioned in my section was actually changes that USDA is planning to propose and that states would then help implement and oversee. So states may be considering other legislation that would kind of go above and beyond federal standards that we may need to follow up offline if you're from a particular state or thinking about that. But again, the piece that I mentioned was that USDA is going to be proposing updated federal standards. And those we don't have any information on yet. We just know that USDA is working on it because they said that they were going to do it back when they released some interim guidance for this school year that we're in right now.
Yeah, and just on that front, we have a lot of questions in front of USDA right now, and that is chief among them. So appreciate the need for further clarity there, and we'll share as much information as we can as soon as we have some more detail from USDA. I'm gonna steal this other question, Carolyn, if you don't mind, on opportunities to join forces to amplify messaging that No Kid Hungry Share Our Strength is sharing with Congress. Yes, 100%. There is a lot of, I think, hand-holding that still needs to happen with some, especially new members of Congress. One thing I didn't mention is that on the Republican side, the #1 requested committee of freshman Republicans was the House Agriculture Committee, which is going to be writing the Farm Bill. And so they obviously couldn't put all of them on that committee, but there is a great deal of interest in the Farm Bill and educating those new members on the importance of SNAP, the importance of especially, I think, SNAP Ed, and a lot of the other provisions that Carolyn kind of addressed high level, and that our SNAP one-pager, our Farm Bill one-pager goes into a lot more detail on. I think that that's going to be a huge priority for us in the coming months to ensure that as they start having hearings and drafting this, that we can help push back on some of the harmful narratives that are going to be are already circulating out there about the SNAP program, especially, and helping these newly elected members, both on and off committee, understand the importance of the SNAP program to communities and the ability to feed kids and families and keep communities strong.
Do you want to go ahead and take this next one? If there's one thing we could do with this Congress, what would it be?
So it's funny that you ask, because I had this conversation with my team last week, and I'll give you the practical answer, not my pie in the sky answer. I think that if there's one thing that we can do with Congress in this coming year, it's ensure that we're protecting the recent gains that we've made in the SNAP program, especially from cuts during the Farm Bill. And we're keeping the flexibility for states and the ability for families to access the program when they need it. I think that that's the biggest danger right now, is, as somebody else mentioned in another question, the potential cuts to necessary programs and the fiscal austerity that is back in vogue in DC on the GOP side of the aisle, is the risk to a lot of programs that are out there. But I want to be very clear. I think that we have a pretty strong bulwark in both the Senate and also in the administration on these programs. It is by no means, a foolproof bulwark, but there are, I think, a lot of very strong champions who do not want to see cuts to those programs, to help push back on some of the things that could potentially happen in the House. But making sure that as many House members on both sides of the aisle understand the importance of the program, understand why, especially the changes were made to the Thrifty Food Plan, and helping to articulate that from community level organizations, I think is going to be really helpful. I think that the other big thing that I will put out there is that the House is likely to pass lots of crazy things, lots of bills that will never become law, but that doesn't mean that we can just sit back and ignore them. We're going to have to respond, I think, pretty forcefully to a lot of those messaging bills. Somebody just asked about the move toward block grants in some of these things. Those are things that are going to come up, whether they ever make it out of committee, whether they ever make it across the House floor with such a narrow majority, it remains to be seen. But they are definitely concerns and things that we're going to have to respond pretty forcefully to, and we're going to be looking to all of you to be our partners in that effort. So I don't see any other questions, Carolyn, but I might be missing something.
No, but we got a few in advance that related to Summer EBT, so I can try to tackle those while we wait for anyone else to answer or to ask additional questions. So in the legislation passed by Congress with the permanent Summer EBT authorization, there was a question about who's going to administer it, and that actually wasn't specified in the law. So remains to be seen with the guidance in terms of which agency it is, or how that'll be determined by states. And a related question was about eligibility for it. So the way pandemic EBT has worked is that in schools that implement the community eligibility provision and serve meals at no cost to all students through CEP, all students in those schools have been eligible for pandemic EBT because those students are receiving free or reduced price school meals. But under the permanent Summer EBT legislation, students in CEP schools will have to be individually certified as eligible. So for students who are directly certified, that's kind of taken care of because of that data link that they're in families participating in SNAP or other programs. But for students in those schools that aren't directly certified, there will need to be a state application for Summer EBT. And it remains to be seen exactly how that application process will work, but it is certainly our hope, and what we will be advocating for is it to be handled at a state level and to not be the responsibility of schools that are participating in CEP, since we know part of the reason you participate in CEP is to not have to do those applications. So it is a bit of a remains to be seen, but certainly an issue that we're aware of and working on.
Yeah, Carolyn, I'm gonna grab this question.
Yeah.
Why were so many new members of Congress interested in the Ag Committee? I think that's I'll give you the simple answer and then a slightly more complex one. The simple answer is largely the demographics of the places that they come from and kind of their supporters. The Farm Bill isn't just the SNAP program. even though that is the majority of the kind of price tag, the Farm Bill also sets policy for 5 years on a lot of other ag-related provisions, especially things around commodity pricing and supports, environmental standards in the ag industry. Lots of things that also are very important to especially the Midwest and the kind of breadbasket, but also Southern California, the Northeast. Every state has an interest in the Farm Bill, and I think that's pretty evident based on the makeup of the Ag Committee. But I think the other kind of big thing is every new member of Congress wants to be able to go back during re-election and say, I brought back X to the state or to the community. And the Farm Bill is a must-pass piece of legislation that it sits squarely in the Ag Committee's jurisdiction. So it's probably the only opportunity that a lot of these freshman members are going to have to be able to go back and say, look, this is what I authored and it became law. And so that's one of the big things that I think is driving the interest in the committee.
And we got another question that I will handle because it seems very specific to Summer EBT, raising the issue with children having PO boxes and mail getting returned. So a lot of those PEBT cards getting returned. That is an issue that we're certainly aware of, but we definitely appreciate the flag here specific to PO boxes. We know it's a lesson learned from PEBT and something we'll be certainly working with USDA on in the implementation of Summer EBT to make sure that there are better processes for validating addresses before benefits go out. And I will say the legislation did actually authorize additional ways of distributing benefits. So it didn't say it must be on a plastic debit card. So that's also something that, I don't expect to be implemented in 2024 necessarily, but is certainly an option on the table to help get family these benefits in different ways that may work better for them, like through a mobile app or something like that. And also allow, if states are still issuing SNAP benefits, not through EBT cards, but more like in paper, then that would be allowable for Summer EBT as well.
Awesome. And it looks like that was our last question. Thank you for that, Carolyn. So I'm going to go ahead and call us to a close here and say thank you to everyone for joining us, but also just put out an opt-in here. If you need anything from us, if you have additional questions that come up afterward, feel free to reach out to us and let us know what that question is. We'll do our best to answer it. And if Carolyn and her very smart team don't know the answer, we will do our best to find it for you. And help you answer those difficult, tricky ones that happen in individual states or localities. So appreciate everyone for taking the time. Huge thank you to Carolyn and her whole team for helping us navigate these difficult waters, and looking forward to working with you all over the coming year in the 118th Congress, but also in states and cities across the country. So thank you.
Thank you.